Chungking, July 7, 1943. The heat was oppressive, the air thick with tension. On a ceremonial platform, General Joseph Stilwell stepped forward to pin the Legion of Merit on the tunic of Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek. The medal was America's highest award for a foreign leader, a tribute to a man the president called the champion of liberty. But there was nothing warm about this moment. As Stilwell reached out with the decoration, Chiang Kai-shek flinched, his body jerking as if he expected a knife instead of a ribbon. Stilwell would later write that the Generalissimo jumped as though afraid of being stabbed. That single motion told the story of their entire relationship. Two men bound by necessity, united against Japan, yet locked in a silent war of wills. Stilwell had spent a year trying to reform the Chinese army, to push the Generalissimo into real combat. Chiang resisted every step, hoarding his strength for the political battles he believed would follow the war. The Ledo Road was stalled, the hump airlift struggled, the perilous route over the Himalayas delivered just over 3,000 tons a month at best, a far cry from what was needed. And the grand alliance between America and China was rotting from within. This was the poisoned fruit of their partnership. The question that hung over Chungking was simple: could Stilwell ever compel China to fight? By September of 1943, the answer seemed doubtful. Then something strange happened. On the 13th of that month, two powerful women summoned Stilwell to a private home by the river. Madame Chiang Kai-shek and her sister Madame Kung, the wives of China's two most powerful men, told Stilwell they were alarmed. They agreed with him that War Minister Ho Ying-chin was the main obstacle to military reform. They even suggested that he must be removed. The sisters proposed an alliance, what Stilwell called an offensive and defensive alliance. They promised to work on the Generalissimo from within, to push for the changes Stilwell demanded. But the meeting was not simply about military doctrine, it was a family feud erupting into politics. T.V. Soong, the brother of these very sisters, had just launched a campaign in Washington to have Stilwell removed. The sisters were fighting back, defending their own positions and their husband's power. Stilwell found himself a pawn in a palace drama that had nothing to do with defeating Japan. The crisis came to a head in mid-October. On the 15th, Chiang Kai-shek formally demanded Stilwell's recall, claiming the general had lost the confidence of the troops. The timing could not have been worse. Lord Louis Mountbatten, the new Supreme Allied Commander for Southeast Asia, had just arrived in Chungking. He discovered that his deputy, the one man who understood the tangled relations with China, was about to be snatched away. Mountbatten moved quickly, sending word to the Generalissimo that he could not proceed with plans for the Chinese forces if Stilwell was removed. Chiang Kai-shek was trapped. He wanted Stilwell gone, but he could not afford to lose face by having his forces formally rejected. That evening, Madame Chiang and her sister argued with him for hours. They persuaded Stilwell to go see the Generalissimo and offer a reconciliation. Stilwell swallowed his pride, put on the act, and found Chiang doing his best to be conciliatory. The rift was patched temporarily, but the damage was done. Stilwell knew the rattlesnake had struck without rattling, and it would strike again. The Manor House Hotel sat at the edge of the desert, the pyramids visible through its windows. General Joseph Stilwell arrived in Cairo on November 20, 1943, accompanying the Generalissimo and Madame Chiang Kai-shek for the first wartime conference, where China would sit as a full partner. The gathering was immense. Every British and American officer of note seemed to be there, along with President Franklin Roosevelt and Prime Minister Churchill. Stilwell recorded only a scramble for bathrooms in his diary, but he knew the stakes were enormous. China's military future, and his own, would be decided here. When the military sessions opened on November 23rd, the strain was immediate. Chiang Kai-shek appeared unprepared, unable to answer basic questions about the Chinese divisions in Yunnan. George Marshall, the American Army Chief of Staff, pressed hard, reminding the Generalissimo that these were American planes and American personnel supporting China, and that China must fight to reopen the Burma Road. The British Chief of the Imperial General Staff, General Alan Brooke, was openly hostile, treating the Chinese with barely concealed contempt. Stilwell watched the performance with mounting anger, stepping in to answer for the Chinese when they could not reply. Brooke later sneered to Marshall that the session had been a ghastly waste of time. Stilwell spent that evening helping the Chinese prepare questions for the next day and briefing Madame Chiang on what to say at a lunch with Marshall. The Generalissimo vacillated, changing his mind twice about attending the afternoon session. He finally came, but asked Stilwell to speak for him. The pattern was painfully familiar. Chiang wanted the benefits of alliance without the commitments. Stilwell was learning that Chinese participation in any offensive would require constant American pressure, and even then it would be reluctant and hedged with conditions. While the conference debated strategy, a separate drama unfolded in Tehran. Stalin insisted on a cross-channel attack in Europe and promised that Russia would join the war against Japan once Germany was defeated. This changed everything for the British. Churchill, who had never believed in the Burma campaign, now had the excuse he wanted. He refused to proceed with Buccaneer, the planned amphibious assault on the Andaman Islands in the Bay of Bengal, which Chiang considered essential for any offensive into Burma. Roosevelt resisted at first, but on December 5th he yielded in a three-word telegram to Churchill. The Buccaneer cancellation telegram was a flimsy piece of paper carrying enormous consequences. Stilwell learned of it without surprise but with profound disappointment. The president had promised Chiang a naval operation. Now that promise was broken. The Generalissimo had left Cairo with a definite understanding that the British would commit to amphibious assault. He returned to find the rug pulled out from under him. For Stilwell, the decision confirmed what he already suspected. The Allies would never fully support a land campaign in Burma, and he would have to fight his way back to China with whatever forces he could scrape together. The Joint Chiefs fought hard to save Buccaneer, arguing that its cancellation would allow the Generalissimo to withhold the Yunnan divisions and doom the entire Burma campaign. Admiral Leahy still feared that Chiang might drop out of the war entirely, but Roosevelt chose Stalin over Chiang. At Tehran, the president had found a new partner, one who seemed more reliable than the difficult Chinese leader. The decision marked a quiet turning point. China, officially recognized as a great power at Cairo, had its promise broken almost immediately. Stilwell realized he could no longer count on British naval support or on any coordinated Allied strategy. On December 6th, the day after Buccaneer was killed, Stilwell requested an interview with Roosevelt. He was accompanied by John Davies, a Foreign Service officer who had served as his political advisor. They wanted to understand whether the cancellation reflected a change in American policy toward China, and how Stilwell was expected to deal with the Generalissimo in this new situation. The president received them at his villa, stretching out a long conversation that touched on many subjects but offered no clear guidance. Roosevelt began by asking, "Well, Joe, what do you think of the bad news?" Then he was off. Ranging across Hong Kong as a free port, trusteeship for Indochina, a $50 million loan for transportation, and the Delano family history in Canton. He talked about how long Chiang Kai-shek could last, wondering aloud whether some other man or group might carry on. Several times Stilwell and Davies tried to steer the conversation back to current policy, but the president could not be held to a single point. He offered no practical instructions, no strategic direction, no support for Stilwell's position. Stilwell came away from the meeting with his last hopes drained. Franklin Roosevelt was a flighty fool, he wrote, hopeless in his understanding of China. The two men who cared most about making the relationship with China work could not communicate. Roosevelt saw China through the lens of post-war dreams. Stilwell saw it through the mud of stalled divisions and broken promises. Returning to Chungking empty-handed, he knew the Generalissimo would exact a price for the humiliation at Cairo. The question now was whether the alliance could survive at all. Stilwell prepared for the inevitable. He would have to force the issue by action in Burma, without reliable allies and without clear backing from his own commander-in-chief. Stilwell left Chungking on December 20th. He escaped the cabals and the endless runarounds. He headed for the Burmese jungle where he could command troops and shoot at the enemy. The prospect of action was a heavenly surcease after months of frustration. His destination was the Hukawing Valley, a rat-hole of a place. 3 narrow valleys threaded through the mountains, thick with jungle growth and overgrown trails. The enemy was the Japanese 18th Division, veterans of Singapore. They were considered one of the best-trained divisions in the Imperial Army. Stilwell established his headquarters at Xingbuyang, a clearing in the woods. He lived in a bamboo basha with a packing case for a desk. He ate sea rations from a mess kit and slept on a cot. He hiked miles each morning to visit the frontline command posts. The Chinese soldiers were young, many only 15 years old. They were cheerful under conditions that would reduce Europeans to despair, but they did not believe they could defeat the Japanese. Stilwell had to prove to them that they could. He gave them numerical superiority in every fight, a regiment to destroy a company. The first test came at Yubong-ga, the key to the Tarung River crossing. 3 battalions of Sun Li-jen's 38th Division had dug in, surrounded by the enemy. Stilwell found Sun Li-jen and the regimental commander and worked out a plan for a serious attack. On December 24th, the attack opened. Stilwell hiked 2 hours over trails to the command post and stayed through the day. The artillery barrage was followed by a 5-minute hesitation. Then the Chinese bugle sounded. The infantry advanced against landmines and concealed machine guns. The fighting was fierce. The Japanese resisted from foxholes and dugouts. When one machine gunner was killed, another man rushed from the woods to man the weapon. It took a week before Yubanga was secured. The Chinese had suffered over 700 casualties, but they had overcome the enemy for the first time in Burma. The victory proved to the soldiers that they could defeat the Japanese. It was the first critical test of American training, and the outcome was decisive. Brigadier Orde Wingate commanded the Chindits, a force using long-range penetration tactics, small commando parties that would fan out behind the enemy to cut his lines of communication. He was a genius of unorthodox warfare, bearded and passionate. His columns had been inserted into the enemy's guts using American troop carriers and gliders. On March 24th, his plane crashed into a mountainside. Wingate was killed instantly. He had created the force, inspired it, defended it. It was the offspring of his vivid imagination and ruthless energy. His loss drained much of the effectiveness of the long-range penetration strategy. The Chindits were placed under Stilwell's overall command. Their mission was to support the advance toward Myitkyina by cutting Japanese communications, but without Wingate's leadership, the brigade struggled to maintain momentum. Stilwell pushed on through the Mogoeng Valley. He bullied, flattered, and shamed his Chinese commanders. He kept the offensive going by his relentless physical presence. General Slim later said that was the only thing that would impart real drive to the troops. By April, Stilwell realized he could not catch the Japanese 18th Division in a decisive battle. Chinese commanders were dragging their feet, on orders from Chungking. He decided on a desperate gamble, a rapid secret penetration to seize the Myitkyina airstrip. The task force consisted of the battered remnant of Merrill's marauders and 2 Chinese regiments. They marched over the steep Kumon mountain range in pouring rain. Half the pack mules died from exhaustion or slipped into the gorges. The men were sick, dazed, and exhausted. On May 17th, the 1st Battalion of Marauders attacked the airstrip. Surprise was complete. The field was lightly held, and the Japanese garrison had only 700 troops. Within hours, the airstrip was seized and surrounded. Stilwell received the prearranged signal in the ring at 10:50 in the morning. He waited 4 hours for confirmation. Then came the message, "Merchant of Venice transports can land." Stilwell ordered reinforcements flown in immediately. The first planes landed at 4 in the afternoon. Myitkyina proper did not fall easily. The Japanese rushed reinforcements and dug in for a suicidal defense. The monsoon closed in, turning the battlefield into a quagmire. Stilwell had to hold the airstrip and keep pressure on the garrison while his forces struggled with exhaustion and disease. The siege lasted 78 days. Food and supplies were down to a minimum. Japanese mortars pounded the field, interrupting flights. Stilwell wrote in his diary that those were terrible worry days when he wished he were dead. The marauders were decimated. More than half had been evacuated, suffering from disease and exhaustion. Stilwell kept the remnant in place. He could not withdraw the Americans while keeping the Chinese and Chindits in the fight. On August 3rd, the Japanese defense finally collapsed. Stilwell wrote in his diary, "Over at last. Thank God, not a worry in the world this AM for 5 minutes anyway." The door to China was open, but the cost in lives and suffering was enormous. The campaign had achieved the impossible, but at a terrible price. The victory at Myitkyina had opened the door to China, but in the late summer of 1944 the entire edifice was crumbling. The Japanese Ichigo Offensive, Operation No. 1, aimed at overrunning the American air bases, rolled through East China, capturing one base after another. General Stilwell, now back in China, received a summons from Washington that would change everything. President Roosevelt and General Marshall had drafted a message that would force the final confrontation with Chiang Kai-shek. Roosevelt's message was blunt, the bluntest yet. It demanded that Stilwell be placed in unrestricted command of all Chinese forces, including the communist troops. It warned that without immediate action, the Allied cause in Asia would suffer a setback from which it might not recover. On September 18th, Stilwell was in Chungking when the president's order arrived. He delivered the ultimatum to Chiang Kai-shek personally. Stilwell walked into the Generalissimo's residence on Yellow Mountain carrying the president's words. He handed the Chinese translation to Chiang Kai-shek in the middle of a conference with aides. The Generalissimo read the message in silence, his face turning pale. He said only, "I understand," and closed the meeting. Later, Stilwell wrote of the moment with grim satisfaction, but he knew he had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. Chiang Kai-shek was furious. He had spent 2 years resisting Stilwell's pressure for military reform and a real ground offensive. Now an American general was demanding command of his armies, and the president was backing that demand. The Generalissimo consulted with his foreign minister T.V. Soong, who had always urged Stilwell's removal. They concluded that the United States would not abandon China over this, and that the time had come to force the issue. On September 28th, Chiang formalized his demand for Stilwell's recall. He insisted that he could no longer work with the American general. The charge was insubordination and disrespect. Patrick Hurley, Roosevelt's personal envoy who had arrived in Chungking, tried to mediate but failed. The Generalissimo would not budge. He knew his value to the Allied cause, and he was betting that Washington would back down rather than lose China. Stilwell received word of the recall demand while still in Chungking. He wrote farewell letters to the Chinese commanders who had fought beside him in Burma. To his wife, he wrote that he expected to be thrown out on the garbage pile. He had given 2.5 years to this mission. He had opened the road to China. He had proved that Chinese soldiers could fight. None of it mattered now. On October 21st, 1944, General Stilwell climbed into a transport plane at Chungking Airport. The departure was conducted in secrecy at Marshall's order. Only Patrick Hurley and T.V. Soong were there to see him off. At the last moment, War Minister Ho Ying-chin drove up, emerged from his car, and saluted. Stilwell returned the salute, asked what they were waiting for, and took off. He never returned to China. The news of Stilwell's recall broke in the American press within days. Brooks Atkinson of the New York Times wrote that it represented the political triumph of a moribund, anti-democratic regime. The story described Chiang Kai-shek as bewildered and alarmed by the collapse of his country. Other correspondents followed with stories that had been suppressed for years, stories of corruption, inefficiency, and unwillingness to fight. The great illusion about China had finally burst. T.V. Soong, who had orchestrated the recall, soon lost influence and faded from the center of power within the year. Ambassador Hurley, who had mediated between Stilwell and Chiang, resigned a year later in a storm of accusations that the State Department was undermining him. Roosevelt dismissed the affair as a conflict of personalities. It was not strategy or policy, he told the press. It was just two men who could not get along. But those who had served in the China theater knew better. General Claire Chennault, whose air strategy had failed to stop the Japanese, had helped drive Stilwell out. He resigned his command in July 1945, convinced to the end that air power alone could have won the war. The war effort in China was effectively over. The United States would continue to support Chiang Kai-shek, but without Stilwell's drive for reform, there was no hope of building a real army, only the slow drift toward defeat. In the months after his departure from China, General Stilwell remained in the United States. He took command of the Army Ground Forces, training soldiers destined for the Pacific, but his thoughts never left the theater he had been forced to abandon. Then, on January 25, 1945, a ceremony marked the completion of the Ledo Road. The first convoy of trucks rolled into Kunming, greeted by thousands of waving Chinese banners, and the Generalissimo, in a rare public tribute, declared that the road would be named after General Stilwell. Stilwell heard the announcement from across the Pacific, the road he had insisted on building. The road the British had called impossible was now open for supply. Trucks could move from Assam into China overland, supplementing the hump airlift. Chiang Kai-shek himself spoke of breaking the siege of China. Yet Stilwell's private reaction was one of dry skepticism. He wondered who had put the Generalissimo up to the gesture, but he recorded no public bitterness. Instead, he wrote a brief statement for an army radio program. He gave all the credit to the infantry, the engineers, the medics, the air crews, and the laborers. He said nothing of his own role. A private message from General Sultan, his successor in Burma, told him the truth. The road had been opened by Stilwell's indomitable will, but the road was a symbol, not a solution. The struggle in China proper continued to slide toward chaos. As the war in Europe ended, Stilwell ached for a field command. He asked for a division, then an army. In June 1945, General Douglas MacArthur, the supreme commander of Allied forces in the Pacific, offered Stilwell command of the 10th Army. Stilwell flew to Okinawa to prepare for the invasion of Japan. He threw himself into the work, driving his staff hard, but the invasion never came. In August, the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan surrendered. President Roosevelt, who had driven the wartime partnership with China, did not live to see this final victory. having died the previous April. Mountbatten, who had overseen the campaign's eventual success, was later created Earl Mountbatten of Burma. Stilwell wrote in his diary that it was over, and he felt immense relief that his youngest son would not be thrown into the battle. On September 2, 1945, Stilwell stood on the deck of the battleship Missouri in Tokyo Bay. He watched as 11 Japanese representatives climbed aboard. Foreign Minister Shigemitsu and General Umezu faced the Allied officers in silence. Stilwell observed their hard, hateful faces under the humiliation of defeat. He stared at them for a long 10 minutes. Then the surrender documents were signed. For Stilwell, it was a cold, hard business. The war that had consumed him for 3 years was finished. A few days later, he presided over his own surrender ceremony for the Ryukyu Islands. He made the Japanese generals and admirals wait, standing silent, as he made his entrance. The band played the General's March. Stilwell signed the document, then ordered the Japanese to sign. A massed flyover of Navy fighters and B-29s passed overhead. He closed the proceedings with a single phrase, "Just cold, hard business." His war was done, but his personal war with illness was just beginning. After the surrender, Stilwell was assigned to command the 6th Army at the Presidio of San Francisco. He was close to his family in Carmel, but something was wrong with his health. He suffered chills, dizziness, bouts of exhaustion. In September 1946, he entered Letterman General Hospital. Surgeons found cancer of the stomach, advanced and inoperable. He had no pain, which mystified the doctors. He slept most of his last 2 days. On October 12, 1946, General Joseph Stilwell died in his sleep at the age of 63. He was buried without a public funeral. His body was cremated and his ashes scattered over the Pacific Ocean. He had always wanted the combat infantryman badge, the simple pin with a wreathed rifle awarded to soldiers who proved themselves under fire. It was awarded to him just before his death. General Frank Merrill, who had commanded the marauders in Burma, said simply that they would have a hell of a time replacing him. In China, the Generalissimo held a very small Christian service at a private home in Nanking. No Chinese attended. Only the American ambassador and a few invited foreigners were present. It was a meager ceremony for the man who had commanded the American war effort in China. But Stilwell had left a deeper mark on the men who fought with him. The Chinese generals who had served under him in Burma remembered his relentless drive and his refusal to accept the impossible. They all knew what Stilwell had done. Sun Li-jen, one of the most capable commanders who fought under Stilwell, later fell from favor with Chiang Kai-shek and was placed under house arrest for decades. Stilwell's mission had failed in its ultimate purpose. He could not reform the Chinese army. He could not force Chiang Kai-shek to fight. The civil war that followed would sweep the Kuomintang from the mainland. But the road that bore his name remained a monument to what he had achieved. He had forced open the door to China, not by diplomacy, but by sheer personal will. In the jungles of Burma, he had proven that the Chinese soldier, properly led, could match any enemy. That was his legacy. Of the men who forced Stilwell out, TV Sung lost his political influence, Claire Chennault resigned in controversy, and Patrick Hurley's accusations fueled the anti-communist fervor of the post-war years. The legacy of Ord Wingate's Chindits lived on as a model for unconventional warfare. General George Marshall, who had backed Stilwell throughout, later served as Secretary of State and led the American effort to mediate peace in China after the war. If you have any family stories or historical memories from the China-Burma-India theater, we would be honored to hear them in the comments below. We read every single one. Please subscribe to the channel and give this video a like to support our future historical documentaries. Thank you for listening and for keeping the memory of these events alive.